God's chosen ones. These 7 marks can't be faked. If you carry them, you're called. The marks they didn't see, but heaven did. Have you ever walked into a room and felt invisible, but strangely watched? Not because you said anything, not because you did anything wrong, but because something about you unsettled them. You tried to be softer, quieter, smaller, but the more you dimmed your light, the darker the room became. They said you were too much, but you were never too much. You were too anointed to ignore, because some are born ordinary, but others are born marked by silence that feels sacred, marked by eyes that see before others do, marked by a presence that confronts people even without a word. You didn't ask for this. You just knew from the time you were a child. I don't belong here, but I came for something holy. And now everything around you is shifting, not because you're broken, but because you were born to carry what the world fears, light. And when light walks into a room, darkness doesn't greet it, it leaves. So if people backed away from you, if you felt spiritual attacks you couldn't explain, if children smiled while adults stared, you may not just be different, you may be chosen, because the ones who carry heaven's blueprint also carry the battle scars that prove they were built for more. And if that sounds like you, then this message wasn't written by accident. It was written in heaven, with your name on it, the diary no one was meant to read. Elara never liked talking about her childhood, not because it was tragic, but because it felt strange, like pages of her life had been written in invisible ink. She grew up in a quiet town where faith was common, but understanding was rare. In school, her silence was labeled weird. In church, her questions were dismissed as too deep for your age. And in her own home, she often found herself staring at the ceiling at night, asking God questions no child should have to ask. Why do I feel so old in a world so young? Why does everyone leave before I even speak? She learned to carry her difference like a secret, like a mark only heaven could see. By the time she turned 10, Elara had a drawer full of journals, none of them finished. But one day, her mother found a page tucked between the covers. It read, "Dear God, if I'm not like them, then please show me who I am." Her mother folded the note, never spoke of it, just sighed, as if she knew something Elara didn't, that the question wasn't a phase, it was a calling. Years passed, the world kept spinning, but Elara stayed on the outside, orbiting places she could enter but never belong to. College didn't, church didn't fix it, therapy didn't name it, until one night, 35 years old, newly divorced, alone in an apartment full of half-packed boxes, she found that same childhood journal, faded, torn, still unfinished. But this time, she didn't cry. She lit a candle, opened to the last page, and wrote, "I don't need to be understood anymore. I need to remember who I've always been." Because deep in her spirit, something had shifted. This wasn't depression. This wasn't loneliness. This was the awakening. And suddenly, all the rejections made sense. All the sleepless nights had purpose. All the strange moments that didn't fit into logic now fit into a divine pattern. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't crazy. She was called. And the signs? They had been there all along, hidden like treasure. Marks not given by man, but written by the hand of God. Part 1. The holy rejection, why they left. It started with the lunch table. Elara was 8. All she wanted was to sit beside Mia and the other girls, the ones who shared bracelets and sleepover invitations. She walked toward them, tray in hand, heart pounding with a soft hope. But before she could ask, Mia looked up and slid her tray to the edge of the bench. There was no room, not for Elara. The rejection was wordless, and that made it hurt worse. So she sat alone, again, picking at her sandwich while pretending not to care. At home, she said nothing. She told her mother she liked reading better than talking. But that night, she clutched her pillow and whispered into the dark, "What's wrong with me?" It would take her years to realize it was never rejection. It was refinement. By 29, Elara had mastered the art of making people comfortable. She laughed when things weren't funny, dressed in ways that hid her soul, tried to blend, belong, be less intense. But even in the boardroom, among polished smiles and curated charm, she could feel it. The subtle shift when she walked in, the half-second silence before someone changed the subject, the way her ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them louder. Her presence didn't invite collaboration. It triggered confrontation, even when she said nothing. And one day, after a big presentation, her manager pulled her aside and said, "You're brilliant, Elara, but honestly, you're just a little too much for the team." She nodded politely, but inside something crumbled, and something else cracked open. That night, driving home, her spirit finally screamed what her lips never dared to say. "Why does my light bother people who say they love God?" Silence. And then, "Sacred, certain, because your light reveals what they've tried to hide." It hit her like prophecy. She had spent her whole life apologizing for the glow God placed in her, pinned it, softened it, tucked it beneath fake laughter and quiet obedience. But the truth was this: she wasn't rejected for being wrong. She was removed because of what she carried and what it exposed. Just like Jesus walked into the temple and the Pharisees couldn't stand the weight of his silence, Elara's very presence pulled the mask off of those pretending. Toxic people didn't flee because she failed. They left because they couldn't fake it around her. They twisted her words, mocked her quiet, spread rumors that never reached her ears, but bruised her reputation. But it was all a shield, a holy filter, a divine fireball protecting her from relationships that would erect her anointing. Years later, she'd hear a sermon that would echo her own life. God removes not to punish, but to preserve. She wrote that in her journal, underlined it 3 times. Nadu, thank you God for every table I wasn't invited to because they weren't ready for the oil I carry. Because rejection wasn't her wound. It was her mark. Proof that she was never meant to blend in. She was designed to stand apart. And that empty seat at the table, it wasn't an absence. It was God's placement, making room for something far greater than approval. Elara was 12 the first time it happened. She was sitting at the kitchen table, arms crossed, eyes darting between her mother and uncle as they argued over something small, something silly. Alone, a lie, maybe both. But as her mother laughed nervously and waved it off, Elara's stomach twisted, not from fear, but from knowing. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment she felt it deep in her gut. He's hiding something. No evidence, no proof, just a heavy stillness that clung to the air like fog. She opened her mouth to speak, but her mother shot her a look that said, "Stay out of grown-up business." So she stayed silent. But days later the betrayal came. Money missing, promises broken, tears in her mother's eyes. And Elara sat on the porch steps that evening, staring at the cracked concrete and whispering, "We did I know, before anyone else did." It happened again at 24. A new relationship. Charming man, too charming. Her friends adored him. Her pastor even said, "He seems like a good man of God." But Elara couldn't shake the unease. There was no text, no lie, no proof. Just that same warning bell. Invisible, insistent, undeniable. So she asked God, am I being judgmental or prophetic? 3 weeks later, she found the messages. Not sent to her, sent about her. Cruel, calculated, confirming everything she had sensed. That night she cried, not from heartbreak but from exhaustion. It's all real. Exhaustion from carrying what others couldn't see, wouldn't believe, and often ridiculed. Exhaustion from carrying what others couldn't see, wouldn't believe, and exhaustion. Ever an aged pirate. Because for the chosen, discernment isn't a gift you brag about. It's a weight you carry when no one listens. Her whole life people labeled her too sensitive, always overthinking. You read too much into things. But what they called sensitivity, God called discernment. And she started to realize she wasn't paranoid, she was pre-warned. Just like Joseph, the dreamer who saw what others mocked. Just like Daniel, the prophet who could see into dreams. Kings couldn't remember. Just like Jesus, who knew the thoughts of men before they even spoke. Elara was seeing in the spirit, long before the natural caught up. One day, a friend called her in tears. Didn't you tell me he was like this? The friend sobbed. Elara paused, her voice soft. I did. You just didn't believe me. There was no anger in her tone, just ache. She had learned that discernment is rarely appreciated in the moment, but it always proves itself in time. So she started trusting the whisper. Not every thought, but that deep, still warning that came with no emotion, just clarity. She began writing her impressions in a journal, started praying before she entered a room. He started asking God, show me what eyes can't. And slowly she stopped apologizing for seeing too much. Because prophets don't fit in with crowds who fear the truth. Her knowing wasn't random. It was a mark. Proof that God had assigned her a role in this life, not just to observe, but to perceive. And now, when someone says, Elara, how did you know? She smiles gently and says, because I wasn't guessing, I was warned. Part 3. Unprovoked warfare. There's a kind of battle that never makes a sound. No fists, no screams, no weapons drawn, just eyes. Lingering, judging, and an atmosphere so thick it could choke the soul of anyone who doesn't understand spiritual things. Elara had walked into rooms like that her whole life. The first time she felt it, she was 16. She had just arrived at youth group wearing a borrowed dress. Simple, modest, nothing special. She hadn't even opened her mouth. But when she stepped through the church doors, a group of girls turned toward her, then turned to each other, whispering behind thin smiles. She wasn't wearing perfume, but still, her presence made them wrinkle their noses. It was like walking into a room holding a mirror they didn't want to look into. It kept happening. At the prayer circle, she bowed her head, only to find herself left out when they laid hands. At the ministry brunch, the women talked in codes she wasn't given. No one ever said it out loud, but she could feel it in her bones. They don't know why they don't like me, but I do. Because she didn't just carry faith. She carried fire, and fire unsettles those who've learned to live with shadows. By 32, Elara had stopped trying to figure it out. She knew the pattern too well. People admired her from afar. But once they got too close, something shifted. She exposed things without trying, convicted people without speaking, and started spiritual warfare just by walking into a room. She once told a friend, "I don't know what I'm doing wrong." The friend stared at her and said, "You're not doing anything wrong, you're just too real, and real makes people react." That truth stuck. The deeper Elara went into God, the more the conflict escalated. People she never offended suddenly turned cold. Church leaders she respected subtly shut her out. Even strangers seemed irritated by her stillness. She began to pray, "God, why does my peace provoke people?" And again, heaven answered, "Because your spirit speaks louder than their masks." One night, after a women's revival service, she sat alone in her car. The altar call had been powerful, but the hallway glances were sharper than swords. She hadn't done anything. She had just been there, and that was enough to stir the air. And suddenly, she remembered Daniel, not the lion's den part. The part before, when they tried to dig up dirt on him and found nothing. So they made something up. She whispered to God, "So, this is what happens when you carry something clean in a world addicted to pretending." That night, she didn't pray for God to take it away. She prayed for strength to endure it, because she realized chosen ones don't just carry gifts. They carry a presence, and that presence disturbs the darkness, even when they stay silent. She wrote in her journal, "The battle I didn't provoke is the confirmation I didn't imagine. I will have to clap back. I just have to stand still and let God fight what I was never meant to entertain." And that's exactly what she did. She stopped explaining herself, stopped shrinking to avoid suspicion, stopped trying to make peace with people who were at war with her light. Because some battles aren't yours, they're heaven's. And when you're truly chosen, your silence carries more power than their accusations ever will. Part 4. The void that didn't break you. There's a grief that doesn't come from losing someone. It comes from never fully being received. Elara knew that grief well. She felt it at 16, standing in the middle of her high school gym as couples slow danced under flickering lights. She was dressed in soft blue, the color her mother said made her look like peace. But no one asked her to dance. She smiled anyway, leaning against the wall, pretending the music didn't make her ache, pretending the void inside her chest was just shyness. But it wasn't. It was separation, a divine distance the world around her couldn't name. She carried that feeling into adulthood. At weddings, she'd help arrange flowers, straighten veils, and toast the happy couple, all while sitting at the table that was never fully hers. At family gatherings, she'd laugh with cousins and pass the mashed potatoes, but inside she felt like a guest in a home that never quite held her spirit. Even in church, her so-called refuge, there were Sundays when she'd worship with hands lifted high, and leave feeling like her soul had pressed against heaven's gates, while everyone else just sang songs. She once told God, "I'm surrounded, but I feel so alone." One afternoon, after a particularly hollow birthday, Elara sat by the window, legs curled under her, journal in hand, and something inside her whispered, "You've mistaken exile for abandonment, but I never left you." She blinked. Could it be? Could this lifelong loneliness actually be divine? Later that week, she read Philippians 3:20, "But our citizenship is in heaven." And it hit her, not as a verse, but a verdict. The reason she never fully fit in was because her spirit remembered where it came from. She wasn't made for comfort. She was made for calling. And calling doesn't bloom in crowds. It forms in the voids, the places where nothing seems to fit, until God breathes purpose into it. She remembered Moses. Raised in royalty, dressed in silk, but never at home in Egypt. He had wealth, privilege, position, and still a hollow ache in his chest that said, "There's more. This isn't it." Elara felt the same. There were seasons where she tried to force friendships, tried to join cliques, small groups, ministries, hoping one would feel like her place. But they always left her feeling more unknown than before, until finally she stopped trying to belong and started asking God, "Where do you want me to build?" It was then he began to reveal the truth. She wasn't lonely. She was set apart. She wasn't forgotten. She was reserved. She wasn't empty. She was being prepared for fullness that wouldn't come from people, but from presence. Now, when she walks into rooms and feels like a stranger, she smiles inside, because she knows the void isn't a wound. It's a womb, a sacred space where destiny gestates in silence. And one day, when God births what he's planted, even the places that rejected her will recognize what they missed. Part 5. Innocent eyes knew first. The older Elara got, the more confused she became by people's reactions. But children weren't confused at all. They saw her and smiled. Not the kind of smile adults wear to be polite, but the wide-eyed, soul-deep smile that says, "I know you." And animals were the same. Dogs that barked at everyone else would sit calmly at her feet. Cats, usually skittish, would curl in her lap without invitation. Once, even a bird landed on her windowsill and tilted its head, as if it recognized her. She never thought much of it, until one day she visited her friend's daycare. The room was bright and full of laughter. Finger paints on tables, crayons scattered on the floor. She had only been there 10 minutes when a little girl named Lily walked up, silently took her hand, and just stood there. Didn't ask for anything. He didn't say a word, just held on, like she'd found a lighthouse in a storm. Her friend whispered, "That's strange. Lily doesn't like new people." Elara looked down at the child's face, calm, eyes closed, small smile blooming, and she felt it. The same peace she felt when she prayed, the same warmth she felt when worship songs played at midnight. The same presence she could never explain. Only this time, someone else felt it too. Later that day, Lily whispered something that would never leave her. "You feel like Jesus." Soft, innocent, sincere, and it shattered something in Elara. Not in pain, but in revelation. She had spent her whole life trying to explain what she carried, trying to convince others she wasn't crazy, too intense, too spiritual, too emotional. But here stood a child, untouched by cynicism, untrained in doubt, who saw it in a single moment. And then she remembered. Jesus said in Matthew 19:14, "Let the little children come to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Not because children are perfect, but because their eyes haven't learned to lie yet. They see what is, not what's expected. They recognize purity, because it mirrors their own. Made sense now. Why animals trusted her. Why children gravitated to her like petals to light. Because heaven's presence doesn't need a pulpit. It just needs a vessel. And when that vessel walks into a room, even the most innocent among us whisper, "That's what love feels like." From that day on, Elara stopped chasing confirmation. She no longer needed applause or approval, not when toddlers and terriers could see what theologians missed. She wrote in her journal, "Let my life be a sermon that children understand before adults approve." Because the greatest proof of the divine isn't found in titles, platforms, or performance. It's found in the silent trust of those who feel before they think. And if a child who's barely learned to speak can say, "You feel like Jesus," that may be the only confirmation you'll ever need. Part 6. The signs that weren't coincidence. At first, Elara thought it was her imagination. The way certain numbers kept following her, 3:33 on the clock, The way a Bible verse would show up 3 times in 1 week. The way songs would echo the very prayers she whispered the night before. She used to brush it off. Coincidence. Serendipity. Just one of those things. But the more she walked with God, the harder it became to ignore. He was speaking, even when no one else was listening. It began with a dream. She was standing at the edge of a cliff, wind pressing against her face, a scroll in her hands. When she opened it, one phrase glowed like fire. "Go where I send you." She woke up gasping, shook it off, told herself it was just the burrito she ate too late the night before. But then, that same day, she passed a billboard on the highway that said, "You're closer than you think. Keep going." And right beneath it, Jeremiah 29:11. She pulled over, heart racing, tears spilling. This wasn't chance. This was communication. She started paying attention. Closed doors began to feel more like redirections than rejections. Sudden meetings with strangers turned into divine appointments. Even delays, missed flights, lost keys, revealed themselves as protection in disguise. The world called it coincidence, but she had learned the language of the Spirit, and in that language there are no accidents. There was a moment that sealed it for her. She had just finished praying for clarity, wondering if she should leave a toxic job that drained her spirit. She needed a sign, something clear, something undeniable. That night, a stranger emailed her out of the blue. "Hi, I heard about you through a mutual connection. I don't know why, but I feel led to offer you a position at my firm. No pressure, just obedience." Subject line, "Go where I send you." The same words from her dream. She dropped the phone, fell to her knees, and cried, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The God she had spoken to in whispers was responding in neon. From then on, she stopped calling them signs. She started calling them breadcrumbs, little glimmers that reminded her. Heaven was tracking her steps, not just hearing her prayers. Closed door? A breadcrumb. Sudden interruption? A breadcrumb. That still small voice that said wait, even when the world screamed go. Breadcrumb. Elara no longer begged for answers. She learned to observe the sacred. She journaled every nudge, documented every alignment, learned to say, "Lord, what are you trying to show me in this?" And the more she listened, the louder heaven became. Now, when people ask, "How do you know it's God?" she smiles, remembering the verse pinned to her mirror. "My sheep hear my voice," John 10:27. She doesn't always hear thunder, doesn't always see visions, but she sees patterns. And when the same whisper echoes from her dreams to scripture, to strangers on the street, she no longer calls it strange. She calls it being chosen. Part 7. Your voice moves heaven. It wasn't a fancy prayer. There were no stained glass windows, no choir in the background, no oil-drenched altar, just Elara, knees pressed into worn carpet, back against a closet wall, whispering through tears. The light was off. The candle had burned out, and the only sound in the room was the ache in her chest. She wasn't even sure if God was listening. "Lord, if you're still with me, please, just say something." She didn't need a miracle, just a sign that her voice hadn't vanished into silence. And then it happened. Not a booming voice, not an angel in white, just a peace, unshakable, it was sudden, sacred, a stillness that wrapped around her like armor, as if heaven leaned low and whispered, "Daughter, I heard you the first time." That was the night she understood. Chosen ones don't just pray, they partner with heaven, and when they speak, even in a whisper. Angels are dispatched, chains break quietly, and hell trembles without warning. She remembered Elijah, a prophet so bold he stopped the rain with a sentence, then called it back with a prayer. And Paul and Silas, praising in chains, they didn't break out because of lawyers, they broke out because of worship. Elara began to pray differently, not louder, yet longer, but with the conviction that she was heard. She no longer begged for open doors, she declared alignment. She no longer sobbed for healing, she spoke restoration, not because she was special, but because she was positioned. Heaven doesn't respond to volume, it responds to faith. And when a chosen one believes what they pray, the earth has no choice but to obey. One night she was awakened at 3:33 a.m. The name of someone she hadn't thought of in years flashed in her spirit. She prayed for them, just 10 seconds, nothing dramatic. The next day, that very person messaged her. I don't know why, but I felt peace last night, for the first time in years. She didn't respond with paragraphs. She simply whispered, "Thank you, God," and added the date to her journal of answered prayers. Elara learnt that prayer isn't just communication, it's creation. The words she spoke in secret reshaped atmospheres, shifted destinies, pushed back darkness, and the enemy knew it. That's why he attacked her voice, tried to make her feel invisible, tried to bury her beneath silence and shame. But chosen ones, even in silence, they're dangerous, because God hears what others ignore. Now, when Elara prays, she doesn't wonder if anything changed. She knows something did, because a whisper full of faith is louder than 1,000 empty declarations. The marks were always the message. Elara never became famous. She never had millions of followers, no stage, no spotlight, no best-selling book. But she carried something heaven never overlooked. Marks, the silence she mistook for exile, that was consecration. The loneliness that hollowed her chest, that was separation. The way people left without warning, the way children clung to her without reason, the way her prayers shifted things she couldn't see, all of it was evidence. She had always asked, "Lord, what is my calling?" And now, after years of spiritual bruises, sacred whispers, and unexplainable knowing, she finally understood. Her marks were her message, not the ones the world could see, but the ones heaven could trace in the spirit. Each rejection, a stamp of God's favor. Each tear, a seed of prophecy. Each unanswered question, a doorway to divine remembrance. She didn't just survive her journey, she revealed something through it. Now she lives quieter but more confident, not in herself, but in the one who marked her. And if you've seen yourself in Elara's story, if you've been followed by strange silence, divine knowing, spiritual tension you can't explain, you're not being punished. You've been set apart. You don't need to force it. You don't need to be louder, shinier, more understood. You only need to be faithful, because the ones who carry heaven's signature don't always get the world's applause, but they carry the weight of eternity in every step. So if this message found you, not by accident but on divine assignment, drop these words in the comments and declare it. I carry the marks of the chosen. Heaven saw what they missed. Share this with someone else who's felt invisible, so they can remember they've always been seen. And if this mission speaks to your spirit, if you want to see stories like this awaken the chosen ones across the world, support the journey, not out of pressure, but out of prophetic partnership. Because someone out there is still doubting their worth, and your share, your seed, your yes, could be the moment they finally remember. I was never overlooked. I was marked.